All right, John McCarty here, founder of Odyssey Test Prep, alongside Zachary, one of our newest tutors. Zachary, how are you today?
I'm doing excellent, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course, of course. We're very interested to chat with you. I think a lot of people out there are wondering, how do you get to a 170? And you were able to do that. But before we jump into the nitty gritty, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump into how you achieved such a great score.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Zachary Zirzo. I'm from Southern California, now living up in the Bay. I went to Cal State Fullerton for my undergraduate. And so coming out of there, I knew that I needed to acquire kind of a premium score if I was going to be competitive in the highest level of law schools, and especially in the top 14. And so I have my background in the philosophy of law and morals. That's what I got my degree in. And I think that can help kind of guide me through my LSAT journey. I know that philosophy tends to be an academic distinction that lends well to scoring a high score on the LSAT. That being said, I did not take any of the kind of formal logic classes in college, which is what I think kind of builds up that foundation for a high score. So it certainly is available to kind of any academic distinction that you're pursuing.
Yeah, and philosophy is one of the degrees that we have found that lends to people having a really good foundation to then build on the kind of LSAT structures that they need in order to perform very well. So you're not the first person we've talked to with a background in philosophy. So let's jump in. Tell us a little bit about your LSAT prep journey, where you started, if you don't mind sharing that starting score, some of the challenges you had, and then where you ultimately ended up getting to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it was a long and tedious journey. I was not one of the people whose brain is just kind of perfectly wired for the LSAT. I've encountered a number of people like that who just seem to get it. And so for
Yeah,
me, it was a struggle. I started with a 152, which is certainly like a fine footing to kind of build off of
absolutely.
with that diagnostic score. But it took a long time for me to kind of incrementally grow that score into what it eventually was. I
Yeah.
enrolled in a number of rigorous test courses, and that could really help develop that foundation. And I think that's what we provide here at Odyssey as well.
Yeah, for sure. And, I have a lot of consultations with students who are at the very beginning of their journeys. And, as students who have that 152 score or 150 even, and you're like, all right, I'm hoping to crack the 160s. I'm hoping maybe mid 160s. And then sometimes they're a little shocked when I say, well, I think your potential is actually probably a little bit higher than that. With the right plan, with the right amount of work, and it is going to be hard work, I think you could even
Yep.
crack into the 170s.
Yep.
Because I'm a big proponent that almost anybody can get about 20 points up from their raw diagnostic with the right kind of plan in place.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And I think it's really like this transition to a virtual setting has opened the aptitude for test increases significantly. Like, I wasn't involved in any tangible way back in, but I listened to podcasts and listened to stories about how in an in person setting, you were seeing 10, 15 point increases, but now 20 point increases aren't, super abnormal. And so I think it's the access to the material, which was really what helped guide me to acquire the best score. This test is very algorithmic. So if you can discover the little nuances in the ways that it likes to turn, it'll use the same way to make a question wrong once as it does 1,000 times. And if you
Yeah.
can begin to identify those and see, okay, well, I know that this tendency, leads me towards a wrong answer. Let me lean into something different. That can really be valuable when you're trying to raise your score to these higher levels.
Yeah, for sure. And when I was studying for the LSAT, there were very limited options. So I was back in 2009 when I studied. It's still the modern LSAT. Obviously, it's not that long ago, but it feels like forever. But yeah, there really weren't the plethora of options that you have now. And I think it's phenomenal how the industry has really grown. Even trying to find an LSAT tutor was extremely rare or difficult, especially to try and find someone who was really good to help guide you through the process. So I definitely think as we've moved digital, we've also increased access to so many different ways of studying for the LSAT and so many different perspectives on the LSAT and so much stuff that's just available for people for free to listen to stories and to find that inspiration of, okay, this is doable. And I think that that's made a big impact on the score increases because we have seen LSAT scores tending to rise, especially in the past few years now that it has gone digital.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's again, just like this access to the plethora of different approaches can be extremely
Yeah.
valuable because the way in which one person understands the test is not the way that everybody must. It's very kind of broad in that way. There's not a monolithic approach that you must use in order to get a 170. And so developing kind of your own personalized idiosyncratic approach is the way that you should be taking on this test. And one of the things that I think is most valuable if you're trying to get into the upper echelon of scores, like a 170 and up, is to have an approach for every single question type and you must stick to it. Because these are the kinds of things that will make sure that when the LSAT tries to kind of muddy the waters and make you confused or give you those sucker choices that look so good, if you have an approach and an anticipation and an understanding of like the ways in which this answer will be correct, it will guide you through that murkiness and it'll also increase your ability to finish the test on time, which, in my
Yeah.
opinion, is the hardest part about this test. 35
Yeah.
minutes is an insanely short amount of time to read all passages and answer 27 questions. And so you
Yeah.
have to streamline that process somehow.
Yes, you do have to find kind of those automatic shortcuts that you're running through, and it's processing shortcuts that I think are the most impactful. Not
Yes.
necessarily, a lot of times people will say, "Oh, my reading speed isn't super fast," which is why I'm not finishing sections. And my reading speed when I took the test was super slow. It's still pretty slow. Like I like to read pretty methodically,
Yes.
but where I save time is all those just like as soon as I hit that question, I'm into my process and my process is running so fast at that point because I practiced it so many times and I've really ingrained it. The only addition I would make to that suggestion is that you have to find a method that works for you for
Yep.
that particular question type and then stick to it, commit to it, refine it, and perfect it, right?
Yep.
So I found people who, they'll go through a book and it's a solid book and 80% of the stuff they really connect with, but then there's 20% that's just not working for them. But they're like, well, this 80% works. And then sometimes they'll commit to that 20% that's just isn't really approaching it the way that their mind works or maybe not the most effective for them. And in those cases, I think it is important to seek out different ways of doing it and then find the thing that resonates with you and then commit to that. So then you put together your own system that is at the end of the day unique to you but you
Yep.
implement it in a way that's supernatural.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And that's why I think this kind of like dual approach is so important. I think you need guidance for the LSAT. This isn't something that
Yeah.
you can take on just by yourself, but you have to take on a significant amount of that burden onto your own shoulders as well, meaning that you need to be in there answering questions as much as you can. You have to
Yeah.
put in the work on the front end too, because that is how you'll refine your understanding of the optimal approaches to each question type. Because again, ultimately, you can read 7 different LSAT instruction books, but if it's not resonating with you, if it's not working for you, it is not valuable in almost any way. And so you need to go and figure out the ways in which you can navigate these questions. And for me, one of the biggest ways that I jumped from the kind of low 160s into the higher scores was asking first and foremost, is this information in the answer choice relevant to what the stimulus was trying to do? So, not even so much as like, is the content mirrored, which is something that you usually like to see, but is this
Hmm.
actually striking at the core of the function that the stimulus served? Because if it's something completely irrelevant or different or it's doing something else, it's probably not the right answer, right? And I took this same
Yeah.
kind of mode of thought into reading comp, and it was super valuable for when I got lost in the kind of nitty gritty details of a science passage. Taking a step back and just asking, what's the function of this paragraph? Is it just supporting an argument? Is it introducing a new one? Is it criticizing one? Can I at least get a few keywords down? and using that to save time. And if you can understand the function well, that will get you the right answer, or at least guide your understanding in a way that's kind of surprisingly, it does it so well.
Yeah, and I've heard that time and time again from students who are studying, especially for reading comprehension, where they're really trying to get the content of it down, right? Just like the nuts and bolts of what did this say, and when they flip that switch of like what function is this serving in the argument, all of a sudden questions that seemed super difficult before are starting to reveal themselves as maybe not as difficult as they once had thought. So I think that's super good advice. One thing I would caution people against, and you said it absolutely correctly, but I just want to hammer it a little bit more, is like mirroring the language or mirroring some of the content. That definitely can be very important for specific question types, but also you have to be careful not to use that instead of mirroring like what is the function of what's going on here, or thinking of what the function is and then using that to direct you. Because as I'm sure you know, questions like strengthen questions, they will bring in new stuff that you haven't seen before, or weaken questions will bring in new terms and new things, but they get to the heart of what's going on. And that is what's important. So when you're looking at that, is this answer choice irrelevant? You can't just say, well, that word wasn't stated in the stimulus, so it's irrelevant. You have to say, well, the way that they're using that new concept does not get to the heart of this, so it's irrelevant, or the way they're using that new concept does. And so this is going to probably be the right answer choice and somewhere I should pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's so hard to develop these skills, because all of these things are true at the same time, right? Like you love to see
Yeah.
mirrored language because that means, there's a lot of the core kind of concepts of the stimulus that are translating over to the answer choices. But at the same time, that certainly does not mean that that will be the right answer choice, because they could just be hitting the trigger words to get you to think it's a great answer. But in
Yeah.
reality, again, it's largely irrelevant to what we're asking. And so I totally agree. And with all of this advice, it has the caveat of there are many things that you need to consider, but these are just
Yeah.
some of the ways that you can rely on some of your kind of secondary traits to get more answers right and go through the questions a little bit faster.
Yeah, and parallel, the reasoning questions are the biggest example of when they start to mirror that content, all of a sudden that becomes a red flag in that question type, because they're mirroring that to draw you in, because they don't need any of that language to do what they need to do. So, there's there's so many nuances and times when you want to really lean into it and times when you actually want to lean away from it. So, getting and I back to the point that you made, like for every single question type, knowing exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to implement it and what you should be looking for, what can be relevant, what could be a trap, and knowing those things in every situation and then knowing them so well that it becomes automatic for you.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about some of the challenges you saw through the study process. Like how long did you study for? Like how many months roughly?
So I began studying at sometime in August of 23. I took my first official exam January of 24. And so I had several months. I wanted to give myself a long portion of time to really develop the best chance I had to attack the test. Frankly, if they had offered a test in December, I probably would have done one there as well. But it's just kind of how the LSAT schedule played out. Um,
Yep.
and and actually, I scored my high score at the time on the January LSAT. I had
Wow.
been kind of flirting with that line. I got 169s like 4 tests in a row. I had not made that final jump to a 170. And then everything just kind of aligned and clicked. And at that point, I was able to score the 170 in January. And interestingly enough, following that, I saw my score increase up into like the mid 170s during practice exams. Unfortunately, those were not mirrored on the actual exam, which is something that's not all that uncommon. And so if that happens to you, I mean, that's certainly not something that you should be discouraged by. It's fairly normal to see some sort of score decrease on test day. But I was fortunate enough to see an increase on test day as well.
Yeah.
And again, this was not something that I was necessarily anticipating. And I had the time in between that like mid to low 160s to push up to that like 170 range was very challenging. Like frankly, it was not something that came easily. I had to invest myself in the test in a way that I hadn't before. And again, begin to really unlock the way that the test functions, the tendencies that it falls into. And again, like in science passages, which were some of the most challenging for me, ones that I consistently lost points on, I took the form of, okay, well, let's think of it from the bird's eye view, as well as investigating the kind of nitty gritty details. In a science passage, there's only so many ways that they can form the passage. It can be a criticism, it can be a complete denouncement of like an old theory, or it can be like
Yep.
a denouncement of an old theory and an introduction of a new one. And understanding the way that the author presents themselves allowed me to gain an understanding of this kind of like stereotypical form that they put these passages in. And just understanding that allows you to kind of contextualize the passage and work through it a lot easier. So it's like some of these kind of revelations that you can get from testing and doing practice exams and doing practice sets, talking to your tutor, talking to your instructor. You gain this kind of deeper understanding, which is really what propelled me from the lower 160s up into that 170.
Yeah, and through my experience, I've been teaching for over 10 years for the LSAT, and I have found that when people get about 10 points up from their raw diagnostic, so you're now into the low 160s, that a lot of people hit a wall. And,
Yeah.
that they have to, because the first 10 points do come pretty readily if you're doing most of the stuff right? You're getting experience, you're taking practice tests, you're getting exposure, you're dialing things in. But once people get to about 10 points, the road gets a little harder and the points come a little bit slower. And that's when usually it's time for a little bit of a shakeup where you do a little bit of an analysis like, all right, what do I got down? What's working really well? And then what's not working? Because I need to make some adjustments in the way that I'm approaching my studying to this exam and start to look for things that I haven't looked for before. And that can be pretty challenging to kind of shift those gears and try to see something that you haven't seen before because you don't know what you don't know sometimes, and it can be a murky process to bring that into things, to the realm of, all right, well, at least now I know what I don't know, and then now I actually understand and I know what's going on with the exam. So
Absolutely.
and yeah, back to the reading comp. When I was studying for the reading comp, I found that to be a really big challenge. That was my hardest section to improve on, but it is improvable. So I always want to point that out to people. Like I started at like -8 or -9 on reading comp, which is clearly not a natural ability that I was going into that section with at the time, right? Now, I did get it to a perfect score, but it took months and months and months and months and months to do that. And I remember one of the things that helped me was realizing the language when the author's setting up an argument that they're going to argue against. Because
Mhm.
if you're reading the beginning of that science passage and just trying to figure out what's going on and thinking that the author is making an argument for this theory that's happening, and maybe sometimes they will, but a lot of times they won't, right? If you're not picking up on the language and then they take that left turn at the end and say, oh, actually, this is all very unsupported because of this new thing that's come out, that can really throw you for a loop if you don't understand, like, oh, they're setting up this argument to tear it down. And just looking for that language, like some scientists have suggested that, or there was a theory that proposed that, or like those types of things that let the author's putting distance between themselves and the idea so that they can come back and really give their perspective on it.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to just like that pure repetition, where when you have done enough science passages and you see a phrasing some scientists contend, you know immediately that this theory
Immediately.
will be denounced by the author. And
Yes.
so just like having that and knowing it like immediately, as soon as you
Yeah.
read language like that, this is going to be one theory, we will be presented with another one, and kind of almost anticipating how the passage will unfold really kind of bolsters your ability to understand it and then come back to it and answer questions about it. And that goes to like one of the core precepts of a strong LSAT taker, which is having an anticipation before you go into every answer choice, right? So like we need to know what we're going to look for if we're going to get it right. Because one of the ways that the LSAT is so challenging is you have five answers, and there's very rarely going to be more than one or two that are just objectively bad, that has
Right.
nothing that is alluring about them. And once you read through all five, it's kind of hard to remember what the question even was in the same way that you did when you read it the first time. They do such an excellent job of like making you a little bit confused or dragging you into something that's not relevant anymore. And so having that anticipation of this is what I know about the answer choice. This is what I know about what it should look like. Keeping that strong through all five answer choices and then using that to kind of guide your understanding of which one you should be choosing is super important.
Yeah, and I would say if you're not anticipating what the answer choice should be, you are not connecting with the test in the way that you could be, right? So even and all of the things you said are really amazing things with anticipating, but also anticipating forces you to predict and start to catalog the patterns of the exam in a way that you just don't. If you read it, you found the right answer and you didn't do any anticipation along the way. And anticipating starts off super sloppy and terrible, and because you're not connected with the exam yet, but you start to bridge that gap between where you are and where the exam is, and then you start to align. And if you haven't found success anticipating yet, then that means you really need to work on that skill and start to build that up, because there's no better way to connect with the exam than having super strong anticipations of what those answer choices would be.
Absolutely. And one of the best ways to develop this skill, if you're kind of early on in your studies, is really invest in review. It's just as important as answering a question is figuring out, okay, well, even if I got this right, why did I choose this answer? What led me to decide that this other one was wrong? And this will develop your ability to anticipate because this is how you gain the understanding for the exam. You go through and say, well, if I got an answer wrong, that means I made at least two wrong decisions. First, I missed the right answer. And second, I chose the wrong one. And so we
Yeah.
really need to understand why both of those things happened. And once you can kind of look back and immediately notice, like, oh, I missed this, it's actually too strong. D was a lot stronger than the must be true stimulus accounted for. And it just sounded good and I chose it. But if you look back at this other one, even though the phrasing isn't great, like it does kind of strike at the core of the argument, and that's what made it right. And so this kind of guided review or kind of going over your questions again is just as important as completing them initially. And so that I really implore that on my students is spend almost equal time answering questions and reviewing them.
Yeah, and the review at certain points of the prep, I would say, is even more important than the actual taking of the questions. Right at the beginning, you really need to do some questions, figure out what's going on, and so that's super important. But if you got 8 correct out of 10, the only place to gain more, accuracy is the 2 out of 10, right? So that's the place where there's the opportunity to get to 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. Or, and there may be some areas where you can improve your speed or you can gain some certainty, but your skills were high enough to get you to the correct answer choice on 8 of them. The biggest opportunity area is the 2 that you had missed, and to really put some deep thought into those and figure out where it went wrong, because there's at least 2, but there's probably multiple areas that it went wrong, right? So you did, in the example that you gave, that you didn't have at the forefront of your head on a must be true question that strong language is a red flag in the answer choices. So your approach to must be true questions isn't as dialed in as it should be, right? And then perhaps you didn't clock softer language or stronger language in the stimulus on the must be true, and knowing that you need to mirror the strength of that language. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same words, but you need to be mirroring the strength of the language to get to something that must be true, because a most can never support an all statement, for example. So, there's other fundamental things that you can go back to figure out, okay, yes, this answer is right for this reason, and this answer is wrong for this reason, but also here are the fundamental things that I didn't do, that during the stimulus, during the question stem, that I need to do in the future so that I will get to that correct answer choice. And then also when I'm in the answer choices, having that filter, that's going to help.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really implore on my students in terms of timing is that going faster is almost never the answer, right? Like rushing through something, if you feel the need to like, oh, I need to speed up, I need to speed up, like you do need to keep that in mind that you need to be working swiftly, but it's going to
Yeah.
come down to a refinement in your approach and the way that you kind of guide yourself through the answers and the question. It's very rarely going to be from you saying in the back of your head, speed up, because what that's going to do is invariably make you choose the wrong answer. It's going to freak you out. It's going to make you overstimulated and not being able to focus on the content of the answer. And so the way that I was able to go, I'm just like you, John. Reading comp was so hard for me. It took me so long to get to the point where I could be an advanced reading comp student. And the way that I did it was not from yelling at myself internally and saying, you need to go faster. It was from gaining a better kind of approach to reading and gaining those tactics for navigating the questions that made me speed through them in a way that I never could have just by emphasizing speed. So it's all tactic over speed for me in terms
Yeah.
of getting answers right and moving through it quickly.
Yeah, and I would challenge anyone out there who thinks it's their reading speed that's holding them back to read an entire reading comprehension section without any analysis. Just read the words, don't answer the questions, just read all the words and see how long it takes you to read the words. You'll be shocked at how quickly you get through the section with no analysis, not trying to answer it, just reading every word on the page at your normal reading speed and going through it. You'll find that you have a ton of time left over, and it gets you to the realization like, oh, the thing that is preventing me from finishing the sections is not how quickly I'm reading, it's how quickly I'm getting to the correct answer choice. So I need to find strategies to get to the correct answer choice faster. I don't necessarily need to find strategies to read faster.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you, did you hear any advice along the way that, or any strategies that just didn't work for you? Maybe they do work for other people, or maybe you think they're universally bad. But give me some examples of some things that you heard that may be common knowledge or that maybe other people have heard that just didn't work for you and you decided to go a different way and found something that did.
Yeah, I was fortunate in that I didn't receive a ton of bad advice. And unfortunately, there is a lot of bad LSAT advice out there because sometimes people try to get, I don't know how to describe it, like tricky. And they're like, this one trick will unlock the LSAT for you. But then it's actually just the worst advice you've ever heard. And so staying away from that is tip number one of if it feels too good to be true in terms of LSAT advice, it is. And you probably shouldn't even try it because it might just destroy the way that you're going to take the test. And so I don't have any specific examples there, but things like starting the LR section backwards, starting with answer 25 and working to one, to me never worked because I like to get through the first 10 in 10 minutes or less. And
Yeah.
having that momentum building up, getting your mind kind of prepared for, okay, this is the way the test works. I'm finding the right answers. I'm feeling confident. I'm growing in my confidence as I'm going through the test. I know exactly how much time I'm going to have left for those bigger, more challenging questions. For me, was the optimal approach. And that's not
Yeah.
necessarily true for everybody. In reading comp, a lot of folks do that too, where they'll jump around. They'll either start with the hardest ones or the ones with the most questions and work their way back. But for me, the kind of linear nature of the test provided a level of comfort in knowing, okay, I have this amount of time left for the harder ones. I want to make sure I'm leaving enough time for the more challenging passages so that I can move through these early ones a little bit faster. And that's just what worked for me over some of the other advice that I heard.
Yeah, and I would say that I would agree with you 100%. And sometimes you do have to decide: am I going to finish the entirety of the
Yeah.
section on test day, or have I shifted to a point where I'm going to do 3 of the 4 passages? In reading
Mhm.
comp, I could see the advantage of like only going to get to 3 of the 4. I'm going to skip the one with 5 questions, and I'm going to go
Mhm.
to the ones that have more questions. But I'm going to do that lightning fast, and it's going to take me a few seconds. Then I'm going to go linearly through the ones that remain. I could see a little bit in that for that specific situation. But if you're planning on finishing the entirety of the exam, get to work, right? Don't waste time, because there's gaps. Where I try to close gaps was just like when I finished a question, moving on to the next question. Like once I got the answer, it's because sometimes I would ruminate and be like, oh, well, let me, and no, I got like, that's the answer choice I got to. I feel confident with it, time to go. And like just getting there as fast as I can and like cutting down the gaps is a way to get. And so if you're not flipping pages, like, I guess it's not paper anymore, but if you're not scrolling through and looking at the different passages, you're saving 30 seconds. What could you do with that 30 seconds? It could be 2 questions at the end of the last passage that you get that you wouldn't have. With the logical reasoning, I can't see a way that going reverse makes any sense whatsoever. Because what happens if you botch the section a little bit and you miss the last 3 questions? Now you just missed the 3 easiest questions of the whole exam that you almost certainly would have gotten right. And you've taken on 3 of the most difficult questions that perhaps you would have gotten wrong anyways. And you're kind of putting yourself in a weird position. And then also the warm-up factor where you're going through and you're starting to get your feet under you. You're starting to really churn faster. I can't see any way going backwards benefits. But perhaps some people have found that it works for them psychologically for some benefit. But I would never advise that for anybody but a very, very, very fringe case potentially. I would definitely agree with those, with those tips that you were giving.
And the primary
Go ahead.
reason, the primary reason is like they think that mental fatigue takes over. And so by the end of a section, they think the likelihood of getting these harder questions wrong will increase because they're fatigued from the remainder of the section. But I remember hearing this, and I do not have a citation for it. So if it's not true, don't quote me on it. But
Sure.
It was some sort of study that LSAT did that showed that throughout the course of the test, there is very little drop off as you get later into the test and later into the section. Generally speaking, mental fatigue is not a huge factor in your test score. And so again, if you're playing likelihoods, which is one of the ways that you can get answers right on this, you should be doing the easiest questions every single time, because that is where you will really raise your score. And at the end of the test, like if you miss 2 answers, 24 and 25 on an LR section, you can still get a 170. Like you don't need to answer the hardest ones to get a high score. And so again, playing probability shows that start to finish is just generally speaking the best approach.
And for me, psychologically too, so like I would always skip 2 questions, at least in logical reasoning, and come back to them. Like the 2 that I'm struggling with, maybe they're the hardest ones on the test. Maybe they're just the hardest ones for me right now in this moment, right? And so I would skip those and then come back to them. And once I'm like, all right, I feel like I've got 22 of these questions right, I can go back and look at that question, and all of a sudden the pressure's off me a little bit, and I can and it's kind of mulled around in my subconscious a little bit while I was doing the rest of it. I'm not consciously thinking about it because I want to be in the moment on every single question I'm on. But when I come back, I find I have a clarity that I just didn't have, and those questions more often than not reveal themselves to me. So padding the section with like a ton of correct questions when things are difficult can give you a little bit of assurance that, okay, I can kind of still relax on this one because I don't need it, but it would be nice to have it for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. And just kind of this final note is have a short memory also. If you're on test day and you have a section that you think went poorly, don't let that translate into your next section. It's really challenging to not let that affect you, but each section is independent of the other. And so if you have a bad section, there's a chance that that is the experimental section. There's a chance that it really wasn't as bad as you think it was, and you kind of maybe fell into some right answers. And so the worst thing that you could do is take that into your next section and ruin what otherwise could be a very viable test for you. So have that short memory. If one section goes bad, it's just an opportunity to do better on the next one.
Yeah, for sure. And I had an experience with that when I was taking the actual exam. It was when I got a 178 on the actual test, and I had a reading comp that I just felt turned around the whole time. I just felt like I was fumbling through it. I was like, that couldn't have gone well. And maybe I did fine, but I don't feel like I did. I felt like I really performed very poorly on that section, put it out of my mind, ran through the rest of the section. Turns out it was the experimental. I took a deep breath, when I got the score back, and I was like, oh, thank goodness. But having that short memory, even the short memory from question to question, if you have a hard question, you cannot drag that information into the next question. You have to have immediate amnesia and just a fully clear mind. What's in front of you, that's the only thing that you can really affect at this point in time. So give everything you have to that, and then you'll come back to the other thing. And forgetting about it actually lets you then come back with clearer vision to be able to get it correct if you do have a few minutes left at the end of the section.
Yeah. Let your strategies ground you. When you get flustered on the test, and you will get flustered sometimes, that's okay. But again, just like center yourself and remember what your kind of game plan is. And that can really bring you back down from, oh gosh, I've had 2 in a row that I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm losing it. The time is ticking. It gets really scary. But again, taking a second, grounding yourself, thinking about what is the way to approach this question to optimize my results, remember it, implement it, and move on. Those are the skills that high-end test takers employ, and they're challenging, but it's super important to remember that you don't need to get every single question right to get the score you need. You just have to kind of move on and do the best you can moving forward.
Yeah, and it's also important that these are learned skills. This is not something that you're just going to walk into test day and all of a sudden have. These are things that you have developed over months of just working on, like, oh man, all right, I did the thing I wasn't supposed to do in this exam. I kept thinking about question number 6. It was supposed to be easy, but it felt so difficult. And by the time I was on question 12, things had really snowballed for me psychologically, and I was not in the zone where I wanted to be. You have to, really come back and analyze what happened and work on, the skills of just moving from question to question. And I would say the same thing too, if endurance through a section is something that you are worried about, that's something that needs to be worked out through your practice tests, your practice sections. Sometimes I would do 5 LR sections in a row, back to back to back to back to back, and just work on that, that section's endurance. Back to the, like going backwards because your endurance may fade through the duration of the section. Maybe if you're walking in and you've never taken a test before, that certainly can be the case. But, you should have this stuff all sorted out prior to walking in on test day.
That is just absolutely true and really valuable advice, I think. When I was studying for the last month or 2 months or maybe even more, I was doing timed sections multiple times a day, basically every day. And so when you get into a test, you don't want it to be the first time that you're under the clock. You certainly don't want it to be the first time that you're taking sections back to back. And frankly, I would suggest that you take at least 3 sections in a row a few times so that you can kind of increase your ability to work through only 2 sections in a row on the actual test. So it's not scary. It's not foreign. It's not only something that you've done before, but that you've done more than that before, so that you can go in, even if it's only with the confidence that you can get through it. That will allow you to score better than if you were coming in with very little experience of being under the clock and very little experience having multiple sections that are meaningful in a row. We want to increase the probability that nothing is surprising to us, that nothing is going to catch us off guard, that everything is within the realm of what we have anticipated. And that is one of the ways that you can control the periphery, by preparing yourself so thoroughly that 2 sections in a row, you're not worried about it, destroying your mental capacity, knowing that 10-minute break is coming after section 2.
Yep. And that goes for reading comprehension as well. I mean, it is a bear to do 2 of those in a row. So you need to be ready for it, because that may be your experimental section, and you got to have your preparation ready. And as much as you can be prepared, test day is going to feel a little bit different. You are going to get a little bit of a bump here or there, but as long as you've done all of these things, like a little bump on a question or like something throwing you just a tiny bit, you can get right back into your mode super fast. And then you can come back and review it, or you can have a high probability of still answering it correct, even though you were a little bit thrown off, and then getting right back into your rhythm immediately moving forward. So even if you do miss it, the rest of the section is still, to where your ability should be. So there's so much psychology goes into this exam, and just like being mentally durable as you're going through is super important.
Yeah, with a 30-minute time, 35-minute time period, psychology plays a ton into you cannot let anything shake you off your game.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I always like to ask this question: like, if you couldn't afford any LSAT prep, like you're coming in because there's a good amount of people out there with their finances are a little bit strained and they don't have the ability to spend a lot. What would be your course of action? If you had very little to spend on your prep.
I think this is the best time in the history of the LSAT to have the kind of restricted finance approach. There is a
Yeah.
plethora of free or reduced price options that exist on the web. I know Khan Academy used to have a ton of resources. I believe many of those have just transferred straight over to Law Hub. So if you can
Yeah.
just purchase Law Hub Premium, that is going to do an absolutely immense amount of work for you. It gives you access to so much. And then again, you do the questions and you are guiding yourself through why are they wrong. I can begin to understand these tendencies themselves. And then, even more than that, almost every major instruction company provides free resources in some way. It'll be
Yeah.
some lectures and then some kind of guided review, and at least maybe one test they'll have that they have kind of graded for you, and they'll give you some information about why each question is right. And so just being flexible and dependable on the resources available to you can increase your score by at least 10 points, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You can make some meaningful progress on restricted finance in this kind of like modern era of LSAT instruction.
Yeah, and I would tack on to that, the LSAC has their fee waiver program too. So if you do qualify for that, Law Hub is free, and the test is free, and some of the application stuff is free. And companies offer severely discounted prep if you walk in with that LSAC fee waiver. So for us, you get all our online resources for free. Our courses are 75% off, and our tutoring's 50% off. So like, that's your first stop, is look and see if you qualify for the LSAC fee waiver, and then do all of the things that you just said. Because if you get Law Hub for free, you've got dozens and dozens of practice tests. And they're starting to add analytics to their review, so you can start to see what kinds of questions you're missing. They're starting to do some really interesting stuff that's going to really help people who are limited financially in the amount that they can invest in their LSAT prep.
Yeah. And the one other thing I would add is use resources like this one. There are a ton of podcasts out there that go over question types, that break down questions, that give you better strategies to implement. And so using the resources that are provided to you just through the course of society, right? Like podcasts are a major way where you can gain a ton of information for how the highest scorers navigated the LSAT process, right? Like that's kind of the point of this conversation. And using these resources will provide insight that otherwise may have gone unknown and comes absolutely free of cost. So it's really just depending on what's out there. And then again, Law Hub and LSAC has done a really excellent job of broadening the ability for people to participate and score highly on the LSAT. And so making sure that you pursue those when that is your situation, it's really incredible stuff that they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And then I guess if you had one tip to leave with people who are prepping for the LSAT, maybe they're preparing for a retake, or they're just even thinking about taking the test. If you had one golden nugget of advice, what would you give them?
That is a tough one. I have this catchphrase that I've just started using as I've become a student, which is to see the nitty gritty and the bird's eye view. And so have the ability to do kind of like look at the answer and identify each word as it is in the answer. And it's like, oh, that's too strong. I'll keep that in mind. But then also maintain the flexibility to take a step back and just look at things more objectively, because you can get lost in the details too. And so again,
Yeah.
it's just that ability to not only understand things in a really kind of like intensive format, but also take a step back and just say objectively, hey, this is a must be true. What is the easiest way to prove something to be true? Not having that much be connected to it, not having to prove a whole lot, just maintaining that flexibility to both be kind of really scrutinous and also take a step back and look at things from the bird's eye view.
Yeah, it is an interesting, like, you're holding two things at the same time, right? Like, here's my strategy on this question type. Here's some of the things that I'm looking out for that I've seen before. Here's what's going on in the stimulus. And then applying it in the most like precise, nitty gritty way that you possibly can, but also, understanding the answer choice in its totality to see if, perhaps they've done something that was a little unique here. I can think of one question that was something about, um, you know, I think it was Japanese people moving to the U.S. and they adopted the U.S. diets and they started getting sick at the same rates as U.S. people. And they said nothing about genetics or anything like that. And then in the correct and as it must be true, and they bring in this new term, the genetic qualities of these Japanese people is not substantially different from American people. And that ended up being the right answer choice, because if they adopt the environment of these other people, then they end up with the same results. So it isn't a protective genetic quality. It is something environmental. So like you have these big ideas like, all right, new terms are super suspect. And I see this new term and I'm in the nitty gritty. I may knock that out. But if you kind of zoom out a little bit, you can navigate your way through and that's one of, the toughest LR questions. People miss that all the time in their prep because it's, it goes against some of the tenets, but it does it in a way that if you're zoomed out just a tiny bit, you can see that they're actually within the parameters. They just did it in a really tricky way.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, hey, it's been great chatting with you. And yeah, we're excited to have this podcast go out and have some of the advice that you've given here reach a broader audience. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here and have this conversation with you. Being an LSAT nerd, there's nothing better than getting to talk to somebody of your level of expertise in such a great environment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zach, and we'll chat soon.
All right. I look forward to it.